Hello receiver. This is a video on Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and is more specifically about how each family member featured in the story goes through their own metamorphosis, not just main character Gregor. So the essay begins. The Family-Wide Metamorphosis. Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis is a short story about a young salesman, Greta Samsa, who wakes up one morning to discover he has turned into an insect. It is not expressly stated what type of insect Gregor had transformed into, nor is there any attempt made to explain this transformation rationally. Before this, Gregor had been a productive and responsible individual and the sole provider to his sister and parents. Gregor's family had grown accustomed to the dynamic in which none of them had to work, and instead placed their financial burden on Gregor. This financial weight was, in turn, what caused Gregor's metamorphosis. After his transformation, Gregor's family was forced to reorganize and find a new way to afford their lifestyle. Gregor's surreal, grotesque transmutation overshadows the family's various reactionary metamorphoses until their transformations are fully realized. Each family member experienced their own metamorphosis due to economic pressure and traumatic events which drove them from their old, maladaptive habits and forged new, independent lives. The metamorphosis is interpreted best when one has a general understanding of the author's own struggles with the capitalist society the story criticizes. Kafka was a German-speaking novelist and short story writer from Austro-Hungary who lived from 1883 to 1924. Kafka came from a middle-class family with a father who urged him to pursue an education in law. This urging would have been commendable if Life of a Lawyer did not repulse Kafka, who instead desired to spend his time writing fiction. Despite this dream, Kafka obeyed his father's commands and worked for an insurance company his entire life. Even though Kafka followed his father's orders, he found an alternate way to pursue his dreams, and that was by leaving his writing for after work when he was free to do whatever he liked. After World War II, Kafka's writing became popular in the United States, where the term Kafkaesque originated to classify stories in which certain elements reflected Franz Kafka's style. Kafka is known for his isolated, alienated protagonists who face impossible bureaucracy, anxiety, and guilt, like what he faced in his life. In The Metamorphosis, the variety of transformations that occur as a result of Gregor's metamorphosis reflect the materialistic values of civilization in the industrial age. Gregor's transformation is of a man losing his humanity to a society that values profitability above all else. Gregor's initial reaction to his transmutation is in line with someone who has lost their value in their humanity. While turning to an insect would confuse and drive any sane person into a panic, Gregor instead describes his situation with detached indifference. He focuses instead on what an exhausting job he has picked, despite realizing his new insectoid body for the first time just moments before. Gregor's peculiar reaction is due to his absence of humanity, which he had gradually lost through voluntary denial of self. When he can finally leave his room and reveal himself to his family, they react more realistically, with fear and self-preservation. Greta Samsa, Gregor's sister, undergoes perhaps the most critical transformation in the story, in which she loses her childhood innocence. Gregor describes Greta lovingly, pointing out his admiration for her violin playing. Gregor even maintained a secret plan to send her to conservatory, despite his already mounting money quandaries. While Gregor's proposed gift seems both benevolent and admirable, it is critical to note the problematic normalization of Gregor's sacrifice to the family. Initially, Greta took on the responsibility of caring for Gregor until the Samsas found a long-term plan. Her role was to feed Gregor and make sure he had water, and to check on him throughout the day, which she willingly did because she was close to Gregor. Greta also takes this role to make herself useful to the suddenly economically challenged family. even to the extent of not allowing her mother to aid. While her efforts may seem benevolent, like Gregor avoiding her trip to conservatory, Greta begins showing her true colors when Gregor's room grows too vile for her to tolerate. It is Greta who first asserts that the family gets rid of Gregor after they find no bearable way to coexist, which is what prompts Gregor to allow his own passing. After Gregor dies, Greta has lost her childlike innocence, and her parents note how she had bloomed into a pretty girl who is ready to seek marriage. Greta's exposure to the traumatic events of the story led her to seek independence, and by the story's end, she was working as a salesgirl and ready to start her own life. Gregor's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa, undergo distinctly different metamorphoses than that of Gregor and Greta. Throughout the story, Mrs. Samsa remains submissive to her husband, who cooperates with Greta to conceal the nasty nature of their situation from Mrs. Samsa's view. Their efforts prove futile, as it is impossible to hide such things from someone living in the same house. While Miss Samsa makes attempts to care for Gregor and even tries to stop Mr. Samsa from injuring him, she still passively participated in the destruction of her son's spirit due to her submissiveness. Mrs. Samsa eventually finds work as well, and through this she cultivates her own independence. Mrs. Samsa's transformation is in her process of slowly accepting her son's condition, finding independence, and allowing herself to emotionally detach from Gregor's tragic end. Her ease in doing so is likely due to the fact that, like the other family members, she had lost respect for Gregor. Mr. Samsa, on the other hand, is Mrs. Samsa's emotional opposite. Mr. Samsa reacts violently towards Gregor's transformation, prodding Gregor into his bedroom and even throwing apples at him. Much like the rest of the family, Mr. Samsa regarded Gregor only as a means of providing wealth to the family. Within this view, he dehumanized Gregor and lost all compassion for his struggle. When Gregor's metamorphosis forces Mr. Samsa to find work, he resents Gregor and only sees the situation as an unnecessary hindrance on the non-working family members. When Gregor dies, Mr. Samsa exclaims, "Now thanks be to God," instead of mourning his son's death because he was never able to humanize him. The key to Mr. Samsa's transformation is in his contradictory attitude towards re-entering the workforce. After being hired, Mr. Samsa insists on wearing his work uniform constantly, displaying pride in his role as provider. Before Gregor was working, it was Mr. Samsa who provided for the family, and he had begrudged Gregor's takeover of this role. But Mr. Samsa was seduced by the comfortability afforded by Gregor's position and allowed himself to be provided for. By the end of the story, similar to Greta, Mr. Samsa is more independently positioned after taking responsibility for himself, not only in status and comfort, but better in mental health because of the pride he feels as provider. While the nature of Gregor's physical transformation stands out more than the others, the close reader would do well to consider these various transformations that take place within the story that are possibly more important than Gregor's. The metamorphosis is only understood when considering every transformation that takes place, because it is in these transformations that the true meaning of the story lies. One cannot help but recall Kafka's struggle with his own father, where Kafka himself wrestled with the demons of surrendering to industrialization. While it is true that Greta and Mr. Samsa are saved by industrialization, for they find their independence primarily through seeking work for themselves, Kafka's critique is of the unrealistic demands made of those in industrial societies. A selfless provider like Gregor is not uncommon in today's world, and it is widely observed that those who take on this role are admirable for their self-sacrifice, even when that sacrifice is their humanity. Mr. Samsa also sacrificed himself in this way when he was the sole provider, and he grew tired and resentful in his old age, likely because the industrial world fosters such an attitude. The various transformations in the metamorphosis work as a cautionary tale warning modern society to be careful with their humanity, because there are powers that wish to steal it from you and transform you into a monstrous vermin. Thank you for listening. My name's Calvin. This is my first time doing a video, and I hope it works out, and I hope it helps somebody in a class somewhere. Thank you.